Better prepared and seemingly more determined, Israel expands its onslaught on Gaza while Hamas sets strict conditions for a ceasefire. But while the aims remain the same, does the latest face-off differ from past Israeli-Gaza conflicts? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. A death toll mounting, no sign of a truce and no real mediation. Israel is keeping up its deadly offensive against Gaza while rocket fire continues from the coastal strip. The talk this time, though, has been of stopping the rocket attacks for good. Families in the northern Gaza Strip heeded warnings to leave their homes on Sunday as Israel widened its campaign against Hamas. The Israeli Air Force drops leaflets advising families to evacuate an area that's home to some 100,000 people. Israel has launched more than 1,300 airstrikes since it began its offensive on Tuesday, with over 800 rockets fired from Gaza into Israel, some reaching as far as Tel Aviv, prompting Hamas spokesman Fawzi Barhoum to declare a historic moment for Palestinian resistance. Well, this is the third major offensive against Gaza in recent years. Israel launched aerial and ground attacks on the Gaza Strip in 2008 and 2009 in what it called Operation Cast-Lead. Almost 1,400 Palestinians and 13 Israelis were killed. Then in 2012, it launched another aerial campaign, this time called Operation Pillar of Defense. 171 Palestinians and 6 Israelis were killed in that 8-day offensive. So what is different this time around? Let's bring in our guest. Here in the studio with me, Ibrahim Sharkey, Deputy Director and Foreign Policy Fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. In Jerusalem, Ephraim Inbar, Director of the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar Ilan University. And joining us from Cambridge is Ben White, author and journalist on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on Inside Story. Ibrahim Sharkey, if I can start with you. Israel, Hamas and the Palestinian groups in Gaza have been down this road before. It tends to end with a ceasefire. What is different this time? Do you see more determination on each side this time around?
I see that we're going to have this to continue for now and in the future because the underlying causes of this conflict have never been dealt with. The problem is not about Hamas launching rockets or about bombing Gaza. The problem is with the Israeli occupation. And the problem is in particular is about the Israeli blockade of about 1.8 million Palestinian people living in Gaza, under siege, turning Gaza to be the biggest prison in the world. Since when you put 1.8 million people in a big prison with no chances for hope, then that's what you would expect. It's not something that the outcome will be different. So we're going to see this, and we're going to see in the future as long as the causes of this conflict exist.
A continuation, you say. Ben White, how do you see the current onslaught on Gaza being different from the earlier bombing campaigns in 2009 and 2012?
Look, unfortunately, there is one element of horrific consistency. You know, this is not a war, it's yet another massacre. It's not so much a cycle of violence, it's about colonialism and occupation. The last time I checked before coming into the studio, and unfortunately this figure is always rising, 167 Palestinians have been killed in just under a week. All those Palestinians have got family and friends who are grieving them, and that's not just emotional rhetoric for the sake of it. For decades, Israel and its supporters systematically dehumanized Palestinians so that their lives are worth nothing, or they seem to be worth nothing. And it's important to remember that if it seems a stretch of the imagination to think that Israel is deliberately targeting the civilian population, remember that this is the same government that has denied Gaza the ability, prevented almost all exports leaving that area for many years now. And it's the same military that in the West Bank routinely kills unarmed Palestinian civilians, as, for example, recently documented by Amnesty.
Ephraim Inbar in Jerusalem, just what precisely is Israel's strategic objective this time around? Is it just to stop and deter Hamas from launching rockets, as they say it is, or is it to invade and reoccupy the Gaza Strip, as some in Netanyahu's cabinet are calling for?
I think the Israeli goal is simple, and it was clearly stated by the Israeli government. We want to have quiet along our borders. Israel left Gaza in 2005, and it hoped that the Palestinians there will be busy building a state, making it a Singapore or a Hong Kong, but it made it a basis for terrorism. And actually, Hamas and Islamic Jihad are widely recognized in the international community as terrorist groups, and they are hating Israel. They want to destroy the Jewish state.
You say
the struggle is motivated by Islamist radical ideology.
You say Israel wants to restore calm on its borders, but how can the rocket attacks stop if there is no political settlement?
I think Hamas doesn't want a political settlement. Hamas wants to destroy the Jewish state. This is a stated goal. The same is true for Islamic Jihad and other jihadist groups that are in Gaza. So I really don't think that there is a political settlement. Israel was ready to settle with other countries, to have a peace treaty with Egypt. And by the way, the cordon sanitaire around Gaza is not only Israel. Gaza is bordering Egypt, and Egypt sees, just as Israel, Hamas, a terrorist organization, and its border is closed precisely for the same reason. Well, Israel, once in a while, closes the borders with Gaza.
I'd like to talk about Egypt's role in just a little while, but first, Ibrahim Sharkey, militarily, Hamas seems stronger this time around than in the past, but they still can't match Israel's military might. More than 150 Palestinians killed so far. What is the value for Hamas in escalating this conflict right now? I mean, they can't match Israel's might. What's in it for them?
Well, comparing this war to the previous two wars in 2008 and 2012, we have seen actually an increased capability of Hamas, where in the first war, the launching of rockets were very limited in terms of numbers and in terms of range. This far, we have seen that Hamas has seriously and significantly increased its rocket launching capability to reach Tel Aviv and Haifa and other parts as well. So what we're seeing actually is an evidence of failure of Israeli bombardment of Gaza, as this is the solution that's going to solve the problem. Because the more you bomb Gaza, the stronger the Hamas and the Palestinian people in Gaza will become, because this proves that there is no hope, there is no solution for the Palestinians in Gaza other than just continue to fight. Because what happened since 2008 until now, we have seen a more strict siege of the Israelis, and I don't understand how your guest from the Begin Center says that turning this to Singapore, where you're preventing even all the exports, and even birds cannot enter Gaza, and then you're expecting Gaza to become a Singapore. This is hypocrisy, and this is ridiculous. Is that to imagine this kind of understanding that you put people in the biggest prison in the world and expect them, by the way, to become like a Singapore, and saying that we have left Gaza and we left them in their own to build the state. How are you going to build the state when you're preventing all types of imports in Gaza, including concrete material and all other types of...
Ephraim,
how
would you like to respond?
Build the state?
Ephraim Inbar, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I think it's quite clear. Our policies vis-à-vis Gaza developed in accordance with the behavior of the Gazans. Immediately after our withdrawal, we are ready to have cordial relations, whatever government will take over Gaza. And as a result of their terrorism, we had to defend ourselves.
Are all the people of Gaza terrorists, Ephraim? Are all the people of Gaza terrorists?
Not all of them, not all of them, but I think that they are unfortunate to be ruled by terrorist groups, and unfortunately civilians sometimes pay the price because of very poor leadership.
The civilians certainly are paying the price right now of Israel's offensive on Gaza. Ben, what do you make of how the situation is unfolding so far, and Israel saying they want these rocket attacks to stop, but can they?
Look, just to pick up on what has been said by the Israeli guest here about Hamas and a settlement and about rockets. Before Hamas was the so-called public enemy #1 for Israel, it was Fatah. And before Fatah, Israel ethnically cleansed hundreds of Palestinian villages, many of whose refugees ended up in the same Gaza Strip that is now bombarded and blockaded. Before rockets, Palestinians threw stones and Israeli soldiers broke their bones. Remember, in terms of the context, the wider context of escalation and political settlement, the current Israeli government has got no interest, even in the so-called two-state solution proposed by the international community. Before the latest massacre, and in recent months, focus has been on the collapse of the so-called peace process in the face of continued construction in illegal colonies. The Israeli government continues to incite as well against Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. So you have a government that in any other context would be treated as a pariah, but in the case of Israel continues to be shielded by the important powers, particularly the Western powers, who only issue statements, mealy-mouthed statements to do with restraint as children are being bombed as they sleep.
Israel has continued to maintain its right to defend itself against a group it describes as terrorists. Significantly, though, this time it has carefully broadened that narrative to compare Hamas to what it says are other terrorist groups in the Muslim world. Take a listen.
Hamas is a radical, brutal terrorist organization which is linked to other terrorist organizations in the region and is not unlike other extreme Islamic groups like ISIS in Iraq, like Hezbollah in Lebanon.
What you see here is very clearly Israel on the front line trying to fight phenomena that we see all around us. Both in ISIS, we see that from Abuja in Nigeria to Fallujah in Iraq.
All right, the comparison between Hamas with Boko Haram, ISIL, Al-Qaeda. We've heard this in the last week or so a lot from the Israeli government spokespeople, wrapping them in the same bundle. Is that a strong enough, a good comparison, Ibrahim Sharkey?
Well, thank you for this question, because this is extremely important. This is at the core of the issue, at the core of the conflict here, the problem. And here there are two major points is regarding this hypocrisy of the official Israeli government's rhetoric over this. One is that for this particular conflict, Gaza, Hamas has been able actually to control the borders and to stop all the rocket launching that came from other groups. With the trying to capitalize on ISIS and other groups is a way of to deviate the attention and to deviate the people from what the real issue is. Hamas has approved when there was a ceasefire is to be restrained and to stop all other rockets launching from other groups. The other major important thing which is critical here is that this logic of Israel is defending itself. Israel is not defending itself. Israel is defending its colonial project in the Palestinian territories. Israel was offered a full normalization and a peace agreement with 57 Arab and Muslim countries in the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002. And what Israel did, it declined to even respond in a humiliating way to the Arab Peace Initiative to be offered full peace agreement with full normalization with the 57 countries, and did not even respond to it. What Israel chose instead is to build more settlements and to expand in the Palestinian territories and to bomb Gaza and to turn it to a prison and then say we are defending ourselves. You are not defending yourself. You are defending the settlements, and this is the price you're paying for the settlements.
But the narrative, Ben, that narrative of Hamas being an extremist organization, not very different from ISIS in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, or Boko Haram. It's very intriguing to hear that, isn't it?
To be honest, I think it's a bit of a joke. I mean, no serious expert on any of those groups would lump those together. And of course, it's the English-speaking Israeli government or military spokespersons who are bringing this up as a sort of rhetorical propaganda point, basically hoping to tap into the kind of Islamophobia that exists in the West, which is the same Islamophobia actually tapped into by Western governments in their own colonial adventures. There's nothing to lump these groups together except to make a sort of cheap Hasbara point, which makes no sense.
All right, Ephraim, would you like to respond to that? And also, Israel is pushing on with this campaign. Is there a clear exit strategy today? When does it stop?
Well, first of all, I would like to suggest to my colleagues, you know, to mature and stop talking this Marxist, colonialist language, and they should better take a hard look at the facts. I think that the Israeli government is basically ready to continue and escalate if needed in order to bring about quiet along Israel's borders. This is what we want. I think so far we get a lot of support from the international community, be it West, but not only the Western countries, countries like even China, India. I would say that we get support even from the Arab world. The Arab moderate states don't like Hamas, don't like Islamic Jihad. They are afraid of radical Islamic groups and actually enjoy Israel battering Hamas.
Do they really? Is that really the case today? I mean, certainly we can talk about Egypt's role a bit more because Egypt has played an important role in all previous truce negotiations between Israel and Hamas. But now you have Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in power in Egypt, and it's very different. Will Egypt be as engaged in this peace process and in negotiations as it has been in the past?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, before I respond to this, actually, I just would like to make a quick comment on what your guest said on ending the colonial rhetoric and the Marxist rhetoric. Actually, fine. Changing the colonial to apartheid, would that be satisfying for you? Because what Israel has created is an apartheid in Gaza and in the Palestinian territories. And as long as the apartheid exists, so we're going to see continuation of this. Now, back to Egypt. Egypt, yes, there is a major difference actually between this government and how the previous government of the Morsi government treated the conflict. When the last war in 2012 happened, Morsi sent his prime minister to intervene and broker a peace agreement and to stop the fighting and to stop the shelling of both sides. Now, what this current President General Sisi has did, who promised, by the way, that in his speech that he, whenever there is an Arab country in a problem, that only it will take him few minutes or a few hours to get there, just the road time to get there. What he has done so far, he has done one meeting only with Tony Blair to get an advice, and you can't get a worse advice than getting it from Tony Blair.
So
and
should,
he made
should
one
Hamas
phone
rule
call.
out Egypt out of the equation then? Should they not count on Egypt anymore? Is that what you say?
Well, Egypt under this government, under General Sisi's government, has to show something substantially different, because what the current Egyptian government is doing is extending the conflict in Egypt with the Brotherhood over the issue in Gaza, which should be completely treated with differently, because this General Sisi has not done anything so far.
Ben, what role do you see the regional countries, Egypt and others, play in negotiating a truce? Do you think they'll have a big role this time around as well as they did in the past? And, you know, what of Iran and Syria? You know, are they still siding with Hamas today?
Well, I think it's interesting to note, first of all, Israel's enthusiasm for the role of President Dictator Sisi in Egypt. And of course, they much preferred it in the past too, when Mubarak was Egypt's dictator. And when Israeli spokespersons are using the language of moderation, they are typically referring to those kinds of dictatorships, or indeed to Saudi Arabia, who most people would not sort of think of as a synonym with moderation, purely because they are American allies and don't challenge Israeli hegemony. I'm not sure at the moment that Egypt is particularly serious about securing or indeed helping to get a ceasefire. I know there's been talks as well with Qatar as well. But unfortunately, at the moment, the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are very much alone and isolated. And it's important to remember the entire context. The Israeli gentleman talked about Israel wanting to have quiet borders. Well, I'd be interested to know if he can actually define Israel's borders. Israel doesn't have any borders. It has fences and walls that are enforced by sharpshooters and F-16s. And until there is a viable solution that recognizes all the Palestinian people's rights, until the international community applies methods of pressure like boycott and arms embargoes and sanctions, unfortunately, there are going to be more grieving Palestinian mothers burying their children.
Ephraim, would you like to respond to what Ben just said?
Yeah, obviously we have to defend our borders, and it's true that along our borders there are fences, and we defend our borders with military
What is your
equipment.
border? Say it.
Precisely because along Gaza, along the Jordan River, I think our borders are quite clear.
Is it
Take a look at the
1967
map,
border? Is it
and we defend them
1967
because
borders?
our neighbors are very problematic.
Well, is it 1967
We don't
borders?
have a very nice neighborhood,
Can you
and,
say
as a
yes or
result
no,
of that-
please? Can you say yes or no, please? 1967 borders? Yes or no?
First of all,
So you've just annexed the West
I
Bank.
didn't hear your question. Second, I would really appreciate if you allow me to finish a sentence.
Go ahead, finish your sentence.
Yeah, what was the question? I didn't hear.
All right.
But,
Well, anyway-
it's quite clear that we have to
What
defend
borders?
our
The question was,
And
what are
because
Israel's
our
borders today? Do you
neighbors-
go back to the
some of our
1967
neighbors
borders?
are very...
You're saying your
No,
border.
definitely no. I think that Israel wants
That's it.
secure borders, and this is enshrined in United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. We are entitled, like other countries, to have security borders, and this is what we are negotiating, although not very successfully, with the Palestinian Authority.
Gentlemen, let's just move the discussion forward a bit and talk about the international reaction to this latest crisis. At first, world leaders seemed slow to react to the attacks on Gaza, but are now trying to push for a ceasefire. British Foreign Secretary William Hague has said it is clear that we need urgent, concerted international action to secure a ceasefire, as was the case in 2012. While at the UN, it took 3 days of negotiation for the Security Council to agree on a statement on Gaza, which differs from a resolution and that is non-binding. Take a listen to what they agreed.
The Security Council members called for de-escalation of the situation, restoration of calm, and reinstitution of November 2012 ceasefire. The Security Council members further called for respect for international humanitarian law, including the protection of civilians.
So, Ibrahim, what do you make of the international reaction so far? And do you, to what degree do you think the international community will continue to support Israel?
Well, this is, there has been no surprise from the international community.
But the U.S. reaction seemed a bit more cautious this time around.
Well, they reiterated the same exact position in the past, that Israel has the right to defend itself, while ignoring whether the Palestinians actually have the right to defend themselves. That's one. Two, there has been some talks, yes, to give them some credits, is that they're going to discuss this tomorrow in Geneva, as has been reported in the news. President Obama picked up the phone and tried with Benjamin Netanyahu to try to intervene and to bring quiet and calmness for the war, but obviously he wasn't successful. So I see that yes, there is a slight difference, but it's still the major pattern that we have seen in the past of trying in a way to convince the Israeli government to change the course of action.
Ben, in Cambridge, does the international community and does the U.S. in particular still have a role to play in this conflict?
Well, look, unfortunately, it's not so much inaction by the international community as direct complicity and assistance with Israel's war crimes. Of course, you've had Congress supporting Israel's so-called right to self-defense this week, just as you have had on previous occasions. But countries like the UK and Europe as well continue to mouth, at best, a sort of support for international law, while with many different agreements and treaties refusing to implement conditions that require Israel to abide by the international law that it breaches, to protect human rights that it does not. And until those sorts of areas are taken seriously, in the US, in Europe in particular, Israel will continue to do what it's doing because it acts with impunity and it knows that it can get away with a system of apartheid, it can get away with these war crimes because the main countries who support it refuse to do anything to stop it.
All right, we'll leave it there. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Thank you so much for an interesting discussion. Ephraim Inbar in Jerusalem, Ben White in Cambridge, and Ibrahim Sharkir here in the studio with me. And do please add your voice to this discussion. You can leave your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can go to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Fuli Batibo. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.